Mr. Miller was a dick. Excuse my language, but I really hated that guy. He was the type of old guy that'd scream at you for getting too close to his lawn when you were just walking by on the sidewalk, or complain that kids playing in their own front yard were being too loud. One time, Mr. Miller came over to our house to argue with my parents over a package he was convinced we had stolen because it didn't come when he thought it would. The guy was here for nearly an hour before going home and subsequently receiving his package. To this day, it bothers me that despite the numerous security cameras set up around his house, he chose to have a pointless argument instead of watching his own footage. The guy was fucking awful. I'm pretty sure he had it out for the whole street, and he definitely made that known. My parents had always advised me to stay away from his house, and for the most part I listened. Admittedly, there were times he'd push me a little too far, so I'd take it upon myself to sign him up for a bunch of spam mail or make fake accounts online with his face and start stuff with strangers online. One particular time I was playing on the basketball hoop outside, and my ball had bounced into his front yard. I cursed myself for my poor aim and contemplated a strategy to pick to retrieve my ball. This basically amounted to me checking to see if he was in the window, and then bolting to the grass to get it. As soon as I touched his yard, he sprinted out of the house screaming at me to get the fuck off his property. I yelled back that I needed my ball, and he kept shouting about how he didn't care and just leave. I picked it up and ran back inside, where I watched him walk furiously to our porch and pound ferociously on the door. My dad ran downstairs asking what was going on. I explained the situation as best as I could, and he just rolled his eyes and calmly opened up the door. But before he could even get a word out, Mr. Miller went on a tirade about how I needed to stay away from his home and how I was being incredibly disrespectful by leaving stuff on his property. My dad simply stood and nodded while being yelled at and then calmly apologized. Unsatisfied, Mr. Miller nodded and took a step back off the porch. Beet red, he looked at my dad dead in the eyes, pointed at his house, and coldly stated, "I'm gonna buy a fucking gun and shoot the next kid that steps onto my fucking yard." Shocked, my dad paused for a second before screaming at him to stay away from us, and that if he threatened us again, he'd be willing to go to jail to end the situation. He then informed Mr. Miller he'd be calling the police, but the old man waved him off and stormed home. Within the next 15 minutes, an officer showed up to take statements. From the window, I could see Mr. Miller yelling and furiously pointing towards our house. The officer came back and told us that Mr. Miller didn't seem serious about the gun thing, but that they'd keep a note of it and let them know if anything else happened. My parents sat my sister and me down that night and told us that we should still do our best to avoid Mr. Miller's house, even though we hadn't done anything. That meant not playing basketball on our hoop and walking on the other side of the street to get home so that he couldn't complain. They knew it was a bit much on our part, but they were less concerned about what we actually did as opposed to what he thought we'd do. And despite the disappointment of having to live our lives around him, we understood. Over time, avoiding his house became routine. Whenever he'd do something odd in plain view, we'd watch for a brief moment before turning away, not wanting to accidentally catch his eye. That was until he started wearing his gun around. I remember the first day I saw it. He was doing some yard work and I was riding down the street on my bike. The mere glance at the big shotgun slung around his back made me stop in the middle of the road. I think I was stopped with my jaw hung open for a whole 10 seconds. All I could remember was staring at the deadly piece of metal on Mr. Miller's back. I sped home, nearly destroying my pedals as I went. As soon as I saw my door, I threw my bike onto the yard and raced up to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I quickly texted my parents and told them what I had seen. As soon as they got home, they comforted me and told me it was going to be okay, but there was simply no way for me to trust that they were right. Later that night, I listened in on them talking about what to do, and they were both at a loss. They came to the agreement that the only thing to do was to inform the police. They both knew it wouldn't be safe to go onto his property and talk to him about the weapon, and they legally couldn't make him relinquish it. As far as I was concerned, I figured the only thing I could do was warn my friends and remind everyone to be on their absolute best behavior. Surprisingly, everything was pretty typical for the next month or so. No children had turned up missing, and for me, that was a win. At least until the evening, we heard a gunshot from next door. My parents scrambled to me and my sister's rooms to grab us and lock us in with them. They called the police and we waited together until the officers came to the door. Unsurprisingly, the whole damn neighborhood had phoned it in. But surprisingly, Mr. Miller was nowhere to be found. It actually wasn't until hours later when he pulled back into his driveway. He explained to the police that he had been out on a late-night drive and had nothing to do with the shooting. Since no one was awake to deny this, they asked him for his security camera footage. Mr. Miller claimed that the cameras were having issues and therefore were shut off. There wasn't much they could do as there was no evidence, and for what felt like the millionth time, they left without taking him in handcuffs. Though we were disappointed he wasn't at least taken in for questioning, there was still the big question of who or what got shot. We got our answer a couple days later, when one of our local neighbors, Miss Ramirez, noticed her dog was missing. This was strange, considering her dog was kept behind a near inescapable gated fence. This is until she noticed the gate was broken and her dog was gone. I remember coming out to see her screaming at him from his porch. Apparently, the two had multiple encounters in the past. Miss Ramirez was accusing Mr. Miller of taking her dog and then killing him out in the woods. He, of course, denied the allegations and slammed the door in her face. From the rumors around school, Mrs. Ramirez had gone down to the station to beg the police to do something, but without the body, there just wasn't enough evidence. As shitty as it sounds, they weren't about to go on a manhunt for a missing dog. We felt awful about what happened. As much as we wished we could confront Mr. Miller, no one wanted to risk setting him off. No one could have predicted how it all come to a head during the waning days of summer. My friend Andy and I were biking down the sidewalk when we saw a family walking towards us. As we made the move to bike on the street, Andy lost control and made an emergency turn into the first soft landing spot he could. That soft landing spot just so happened to be Mr. Miller's yard. I remember seeing the torn up grass as he and his bike dug into the freshly made lawn. I remember screaming, "Shit," as I slapped my hands on my head while lying there, collecting himself. I was about to run and grab him, but as soon as I did, I saw the terrifying old man step from his porch. I froze in fear. "Oh my God!" he yelled. In a fit of rage, he rushed towards Andy, arms outstretched and gun swinging from the strap on his back. Everything happened so quickly. The next thing I knew, Mr. Miller had his arm wrapped tightly around Andy's neck. I could see him struggling against the surprising strength of Mr. Miller as he was dragged into the house. I sprinted over to grab my friend, but stopped short when he flashed a small knife. I could see tears rolling down Andy's eyes as he screamed and furiously fought to free himself. And in just a few short seconds, they were gone. I immediately called the police to report the hostage and waited for what felt like hours until they came. But the tension of waiting for them to arrive was nothing compared to when they went into the house. I could hear screaming and a gunshot, some return fire, and then silence. To my relief, Mr. Miller was eventually brought out in handcuffs. I remember him giving me a nasty scowl as he walked by. Andy was brought out mere moments later. His neck was bruised, but luckily he was okay otherwise. The one thing that has stuck with me most happened after the police had raided his home, taken numerous bags out, and left the scene. Knowing no one was there, I decided it was worth taking a look inside Mr. Miller's house. It was absolutely disgusting. The man was definitely a hoarder. Rotten food was everywhere. Trash was piling up, and there was a smell that would make you intensely ill if you hung around it long enough. I tried to think back to what I saw earlier that day. I remember the bag smelling of something foul as they passed by me, but when I looked inside, it was beyond what I could have ever contemplated. Pieces of cats and dogs were chopped up and strewn about the stove. I didn't know if he had been feasting on them or if he gained some sort of sick amusement from it. Whenever I tried to talk to Andy about what he saw in there, he just shook his head and silently told me he never wanted to talk about it. Since that day, I've always gotten this dark feeling in the pit of my stomach. What if he was waiting for a kid to do something like that? He had always come out so quickly whenever one of us got too close. It would have been easy for him to monitor us from his security cameras, right? Maybe there was a reason he tried to drag Andy into his house instead of scaring him away. I don't know. I could be getting ahead of myself since I don't have any proof. The thought just scares me. Still though, I can't help but shake the feeling that there was a decent chance that Andy nearly ended up like Miss Ramirez's dog.